All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here on a Friday midday. What I have for you actually is a mystery. Some of the mystery's been solved over the last 3 months, and some of it has not yet been solved. But I'm going to bring you up to date on the status of the research, what has been discovered, what we know absolutely for sure, and what we are still going to be looking into a little bit later. But this story begins with Mrs. Gilgore, a woman I've never met actually. Mrs. Gilgore in the spring was at Raggedy Annie's, a small antique shop, Park Hills, Main Street. And she saw a lot of Flat River Junior College, Mineral Area College memorabilia. She talked to the owner, Gene Fritchie, and he said, we're thinking about closing the shop, moving on, traveling more. And Mrs. Gilgore said to him, why don't you contact the college? They might be interested in the Flat River Junior College, Mineral Area College artifacts. So Mr. Fritchie called the college, had a conversation with Dr. Gilgore's office. Dr. Gilgore sent an email to me and said, would you contact Gene Fritchie and ask about this proposal of his? I did, and then I went down to the store. So the first time I was actually in that store was May the 16th of this year, 2025, and I was there looking at Flat River Junior College, Mineral Area College memorabilia, and he has a lot of it there. He's a collector. He's a local historian. As I'm finishing up the visit, talking about what he has that might be appropriate for what we were thinking of doing here at the college, he points to the front of the store, and he says, those two bathtubs are from the St. Louis World's Fair, 1904. I am by nature skeptical, but I took a photograph. He had a little index card, 1904 World's Fair exhibit, Gustav Lind, bathtub. And then I went home and I started digging, searching, researching, Google, trying to find out, are these actually items that were on exhibit at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, formerly known as the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. So I start looking. The first two things I encounter are English language articles. And this was about all I could find at the beginning with an initial, surface search. The first one is from 2017. The second one is from 2019. And at some point, the man pictured there in that photograph on the left, his name is Denzil Jennings. At some point, Denzil Jennings, the man who discovered these two items in 1973, and Melissa Workman, who ended up owning one of these items, they took both of them up to St. Louis in July of 2017 because Antiques Roadshow was going to be there. Looking at items that people have in their attics and basements. They don't know what they are, they don't know where they came from, they don't know the full story, they don't know the price, so they took them there. And two English language publications talked about that. The 2017 St. Louis Magazine just mentions in passing that two people had come up from Farmington and they had two bathtubs with them. And then in 2019, when these two bathtubs were put on exhibit at the Farmington Library, the public library, the Daily Journal did a story, front page. Pam Clifton, she writes a lot of stories around here. And she references that the Antiques Roadshow solved the tub mystery, meaning they were able to say to the owners, Gustav Lind is the man who created these bathtubs, and they were able to say to those two that he, not that these items, but that he was actually had items on exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair. So a little bit of the mystery was solved, but all along people were calling these bathtubs, and there's no evidence that they were at the St. Louis World's Fair. Now, the gentleman I mentioned, Denzel Jennings, this is also Mr. Jennings with a photograph of the property he owns about 5 miles south of Farmington. And that's where he discovered these. On that property, the blue flag is our college. You can see Farmington there in the middle. And right here, that red pin is his property. He bought that property in 1973. At some point in 1973, could have been the year after, his wife notices an area of the property that's overgrown. It's gone back to the wild. Nature has taken it over again. And she wants that cleaned out. So Mr. Jennings goes out. It's all the way down this road, about 1.5 miles off Highway H near Knoblick. Mr. Jennings goes out and he begins to dig around to, just eliminate this debris in the yard that his wife doesn't want. And at some point, his shovel, metal, hits metal. So he starts looking a little more gingerly and finds some metal item, but it had started to sink into the ground by about 1 foot, these two items. He eliminates the debris. Eventually he's able to dig them out of the ground. He's able to pull them out, and this is what they looked like at the time. Someone had painted them white. You can notice that the liner on the inside had decayed. It was made of tin. The outside is bronze. Probably the white paint helped protect them. They had no idea what they were. They had no idea where they came from. They just knew they had something that was a little unique and unusual. Mrs. Jennings liked to get things fixed up. She liked to preserve history. And so she started looking around, and her husband started looking around for somebody who could restore these two items. Whatever these two items happened to be, she wanted them restored. They didn't know anything about them. None of the provenance. They didn't know who had done them. They didn't know where they came from. They didn't know the origin. None of that. But they sent them to some metalsmiths down at Cape Girardeau. And the metalsmiths started removing the liner that was decayed, getting the paint off the surface, stabilizing, the skeleton structure of these items. This was 1981, and restoring them. Jump ahead a few years, 2021, Melissa Workman and Bruce Workman, her husband, who owned one of these and had gone with Mr. Jennings up to the Antiques Roadshow, they decide to sell their item that they had purchased from Mr. Jennings when he sold to them the McCormick House, the historic McCormick House in Farmington that they also had restored and gotten put on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is the post that he made at his Raggedy Annie store to say that they had one of these 1904 World's Fair items, 2 brass bathtubs made by the artisan, and he owned one of them at this point. Jump ahead a couple of years again, and Mr. Jennings is 90 years old. He's beginning to think about the liquidation of his estate, and he, through the Workmans, contacts Mr. Fritchie, Jean and Annette Fritchie, and offers to them, before he passes away, obviously, before there's an auction where these items could go to anyone, because he wanted them back together again. He found them together in 1973, and he wanted them back together again as he was transitioning out of this life. So they bought them. And then they had 2, the Fritchies. They had both of them. The 2 that were found in 1973, by that date, 2022, are at Raggedy Annie's on Main Street in Park Hills. And then I walk into the store 3 months ago and he says, these are from the World's Fair. So that's the first bit of information I was able to discover about these. So I, at that point, started looking for Gustav Lind himself. Who was he? I couldn't find anything about Gustav Lind himself. No matter what I searched for, Gustav Lind in Germany, Gustav Lind in the World's Fair, wasn't able to find any information about him. And then finally, I came across this book online. This was published by the German exhibitors at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And when I saw the cover of it, I thought, if he was at the fair, if Gustav Lind was actually there, or if these two bathtubs, quote unquote, were there, they'd be listed in this book. It was a big book, plus 500 pages or more. So I start searching this book, and I go to the table of contents, and I discover his name. That was the first confirmation evidence that Gustav Lind was actually at, or his items were at, the 1904 World's Fair. I turn to these pages, I begin looking around. I find now that whatever the Germans had, much of it was at the Palace of Varied Industries on the grounds of the St. Louis World's Fair. And then I find his actual entry. His address: in the Court of Honor, 2 bronze flower stands filled out with wrought figures, 2 large lions' heads in bronze, hygienic bath, pillars, and gates in bronze. Not a word about bathtubs. And for 50 years, everyone called these bathtubs tubs. I noticed that about bath, and I thought, well, maybe they were there. Maybe these 2 bathtubs were there, but they didn't get on this list. Something happened. They weren't included here, but they were actually there. Because when you're doing a research project, you're hoping that your thesis, that these were at the World's Fair, proves to be true. And when you find evidence that doesn't completely support that thesis, sometimes you begin to have magical thinking about that evidence. Well, maybe they're in the bath exhibit. I also found this: bronze pillars, bronze railings, again, a mention of the bath exhibit. But no mention of bathtubs, no mention of tubs. So I'm thinking, and we're all thinking, somebody had these 2 beautiful items, and they put them in a yard, and they let nature take them back. Sort of like today even. We use bathtubs today as planters. We put them out in our yard and grow flowers. So that was the thought. Somebody took these 2 beautiful bathtubs, and they put them out in the yard. They started using them as a planter. They were overgrown, but that's not what they were really for originally. More on Gustav Lind. I then decided I'm going to go to Ancestry.com. I'm going to see what I can find at Ancestry. Immediately, I'm able to find his baptismal record. So I knew then he was born in 1856. The names of his parents: Joseph Andreas Lind and Magdalena Graf. I was able to find his death certificate, and then I knew that he died on the 22nd of January, 1903. Immediately, I'm thinking, if he died in January of 1903, and the World's Fair started in April of 1904, how did these items get made by him and end up at the World's Fair? We'll come back to that question. I had a friend of mine translate this death information because Google Translate wasn't doing that good of a job. And I learned that he died at 11 o'clock. He lived on Blumshof. He was 46, single, Catholic. He was a chiseler, a sculptor, a metalsmith, a metal sculptor, son of a civil servant, and that this information was provided, and now I had the name of his brother, Nicholas. That is the home he died in. That's Blumshof number 2, south of the Tiergarten region in Berlin, which is the center of all of Berlin artistic society. That is the street that he lived on in 1903, the year he died. That home is pictured in about 1912 but within a reasonable period of time of his death. None of that exists anymore because of World War II and the firebombing of Berlin. In fact, because of what happened in Germany during World War II, I really didn't expect to find much in terms of printed records like newspapers. But once I had his birth certificate and had his death certificate, then I wanted to see if I could find anything in any German language newspaper. So I started researching German language newspapers. And I must say, I wasn't able to come up with much. I was able to come up, though, with 4 important appearances in a German language newspaper in January of 1903, the month that he died. This here is simply an announcement by his brother Nicholas, by his sister Rosa, that after a short illness, the metal sculptor, our brother, passed away on the 26th. A day later, another death announcement, this one from the Association of Berlin Artists. They call him Mr. Metal Sculptor, Gustav Lind. And then I had the name of the cemetery, St. Matthias Cemetery in Sudendi. I'd never heard of Sudendi, so that was another area I had to begin exploring. A thank you note from the family after the funeral, January 26th. Our beloved brother, the metal sculptor, just expressing appreciation to everybody who had offered their condolences, who had come to the cemetery, the funeral service. And then a week or two later, the announcement that the business has been sold, and Paul Kruger now would own the business that Gustav Lind had owned prior to his death in January 1903. And that business actually will continue. I was able to find references to it into the 1920s under the name Gustav Lind. So his name was of such repute, such good reputation, that they continued using the name even after he'd passed away and it had been purchased by someone else. Now, back to that question. If he died in January of 1903, and if the World's Fair exhibit ran from April to December of 1904, does this potentially cast doubt on the authenticity of Gustav Lind as the creator of these 2 items that you know we now have across the way there in our Mack Museum? I say no, for many reasons. One of which is his name is on the items, G. Lind, 04. On all 4, on 2 sides and 2 sides, on all 4 of the sides of these 2 items, his name appears. Secondly, originally, the St. Louis World's Fair was supposed to start in April of 1903. Remember, it was an event to celebrate the Louisiana Purchase. So 1803, 1903, the centennial would make sense. You will notice in May of 1902, as late as that period, the idea was still that the fair would happen beginning April of 1903. The next month, June of 1902, 1 month later, the decision has been made to postpone it by 1 year. This, by the way, was the official monthly publication of the Louisiana Purchase Corporation, published between 1899, well in advance of the fair, until the end of the fair in December 1904. So obviously, the initial idea was that they would be having the fair in 1903. He was working on these things. There's no doubt about it. You don't just get an item like these 2 done within 1 month period. Additionally, remember, everything had to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. Everything then had to get on a train and be brought to St. Louis. Everything then had to be put into the actual German exhibit. The point being, all of these items that were going to be in the World's Fair were done well in advance, at least 1 year in advance. Now, obviously, since in June 1902, the fair is changed to 1904, and he puts 04 on these 2 items, at some point in the fall of 1902, he finishes these items, he puts his name on these items, and then early in 1903, mid-1903, after he's deceased, they're shipped over. Other works that I've been able to find of this guy, he was quite prolific and he was very good. This was created in the late 1890s. It no longer exists in Berlin. This was done in 1897. He was responsible only for this part of this public exhibit celebrating Kaiser Wilhelm. Two 4-horse carriages, the northern one by Gustav Lind. I also found in Potsdam some of his work, including here at the Sanssouci Park in Potsdam, which was built in the beginning by Frederick the Great in the 1740s, and he did this, the Archer. You always had a designer, like an architect, but then you had the person who did the work, a creator. That's a better image of it. So he was doing a lot of work long before the St. Louis World's Fair. This is another one he did. This one was planted on territory that the Danes and the Germans were disputing. And the Germans came to fear that the Danes would destroy it, so they actually took the sculpture and moved it into undisputed German territory. And then indeed, during World War II, the Danes blew up the rock base that was included. But this still exists. You can still see it. In this 1899 Berlin Architecture World publication, I learned that he had done this copper work here at the front of the building. He did these radiator grates, 1899. One of the outstanding artisans, there he is, the chiseler Lind. He did these tops of these columns, the capitals here. He did these decorative pieces of work on a wash toilet, a bidet. He also did these radiator covers. This is 1901. In 1903, he did these lampstands. And here we finally get our first reference. Now, this is in 1905, a year after the fair, but the first reference to the St. Louis World's Fair of 1904. And there's a mention that the German palace on the grounds, there were 62 nations at the fair. It covered 1,200 acres of territory, the entire west half of Forest Park, and into that area that's now part of Clayton. But this mentions that the German palace there was designed after the Charlottenburg Palace, and you will be able to see that right here. That's the German palace on the grounds of the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. This is the Grand Basin. If you've been to St. Louis Forest Park recently, you see the Grand Basin. It's in the same location that the Grand Basin was in during the World's Fair. You've got Art Hill then that goes up to the Art Museum. That Art Museum is one of the original structures from the fair. There aren't many left. The administrative building of Washington University was there. That's still there. It was used by the World's Fair Corporation. The bird cage in the zoo was part of the 1904 World's Fair, and it's still there. And the Art Museum and this Grand Basin. There's a close-up. This is the original, and this is what it looked like on the grounds of the St. Louis World's Fair. I mean, people went to extraordinary efforts to exhibit their nation, to show the world what their people could do. Humans had started having these regional fairs back in the 1790s, but it wasn't really until 1851 that you had what we consider the first true World's Fair. And that was done in London. It was called the Crystal Palace. Interest in world fairs peaked and continued into the 1930s. In 1893, you had the World's Fair in Chicago, which was hugely successful. St. Louis, as the fourth largest city in the country at the time, in 1904 wanted to top the Chicago event, and they certainly did. It held from April 30 to December 1. 43 of our 45 states were present, 62 nations, 1,200 acres, and probably about 20 million people came to the fair. There's the Grand Basin. There's the German Palace. There's the Art Museum that is still there. This is Washington University campus that was used at the time. And this is the Palace of Manufacturers, the Palace of Liberal Arts. But this one right here is the one we're going to be focusing on. That's the Palace of Varied Industries. And these two items we have on our campus were located there. It was a big deal when this fair opened. People from all over the world and all over the United States were attending. Front page news in many papers worldwide. This one just happens to be the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. This is the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch when the fair opens in April of 1904. Estimated attendance on day one, 237,000 people. This is a photograph taken of the entrance into the park, and I'm pointing it out here because these two towers in the background are the entrance to the Palace of Varied Industries on the east side, which is where the German exhibition was. So the point being, this was the main entrance into the fair. So you potentially had millions of people coming through the main entrance of the fair. Immediately on their right, they're seeing the Palace of Varied Industries. They're seeing the entrance with the two towers, and they walk in and they're immediately in the German exhibition. I'll show you a photograph of how that would have been for them. This is where the fair was. All of this is the west half of Forest Park and then over into Clayton. This is kind of a cool little map because it shows this is the current map, right? And then on top of it, they have put all of the buildings from the World's Fair. Including here is the Art Museum, there's the bird cage that still exists, there's the administration building of Washington University. But you can see this fair went all the way over into this space that is now Clayton, Missouri. And there, right there, is the Palace of Varied Industries. That's the current history museum in the park, and the main entrance was off of Lindell, and you would come in the main entrance about right here, and right to your right was the Palace of Varied Industries. That was the Pike, they called it, which was 1 mile long with lots of different nations representing themselves there. Oh yes, I do want to show you this. After they had cleared Forest Park, because they had to cut down hundreds and hundreds of trees, once they had cleared Forest Park, people who liked golf had an idea. It's already cleared, the trees are gone, and that's when they created the golf course up in Forest Park, right after. In fact, I think the date on this is like 1912 or something. That's sort of what it looked like. There's the German Palace, Palace of Varied Industries. You've got a campground up here for people who can't afford to actually stay in a hotel during the fair. This is the main entrance into the fair off Lindell. It was beautiful. Everything, though, was temporary. Nothing there was to last more than 7 months. It would all come down. It was made of wood, plaster of Paris. It was all temporary. Sometimes they'd throw a little concrete in the plaster of Paris, like if they were going to build steps or a walkway. But it was all temporary. There's another image from the fair itself. Postcards from Germany, including the palace that we're looking at eventually. I want you to notice here on this map, you've got all of these trains lined up. This is how people got to the fair. They took a train from wherever they lived. They came to St. Louis. Once they were in St. Louis at Union Station, a train would take them right to the grounds of the fair. And this is the main entrance into the fair. This is an advertisement from Berlin, announcing that they have good bargains for taking people from Berlin across the Atlantic Ocean so they can see the fair. These are advertisements that appeared in Nebraska and Texas announcing we've got a train system that can get you to the World's Fair. The Frisco system had a specific line running right up to the grounds of the World's Fair, the Wabash Railroad. Here's St. Louis right there. You can see all of these people in the Great Lakes region would be able to easily make their way to the fair. I mean, this was a huge event. Even here, this is in Bonne Terre, even in our area, a lot of people were traveling from Bonne Terre up to the World's Fair. Here are some of these local items in the Bonne Terre newspaper: World's Fair, World's Fair, World's Fair, World's Fair, World's Fair. People are announcing they're at the fair. They're taking the train up. They're getting out of Bonne Terre. They're getting away from St. Francis County for a little while. They're going to go be sophisticated at the St. Louis World's Fair. World's Fair, 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 several days, fair. Today we'd put it on our social media, right? Well, this is the social media of that day. It was at the newspaper. You'd pay them a nickel and they'd put it in the paper for you, and everybody would know you'd been to the fair. Then I came across this book, which was also helpful, because once again it showed me where the German exhibit was in this particular Palace of Industries that we've been looking at. And it also, again, gave me the name Gustav Lind. It did not, however, mention bathtubs or tubs. So I'm still wondering, why are we not getting a mention of bathtubs when I'm looking at Gustav Lind's name? Why are there no bathtubs associated with his name? Then I came across this book, and this was the key in many ways. They announced that they have the largest and best that Germany has ever made. This is a German publication. They want to show America what Germany can do, what's new and what's best in the line of German effort. And as I'm looking through this book, I notice this picture. There's our bathtub. This was taken at the World's Fair. And I remember that they mentioned lion's heads as one of Gustav Lind's contributions to the fair. So I look down to read the caption, and I see a word I've never seen before. Jardinieres. Bronze. Jardinieres. Raise your hand if you know what a jardiniere is. Does anyone? Okay, so we're all equally unaware. Had no idea what it was. So I look at it, I Google it. It's a flower stand. It's a planter. It's a big vase. And that was the key for me. I've been searching for bathtubs. I've been searching for tubs. For 50 years, everyone who's been associated with these two items, everything that has been printed about these two items, calls them bathtubs or tubs. And they're not. They were in that yard 5 miles south of Farmington because they're supposed to be in a yard. They're supposed to have soil in them. They're supposed to have flowers growing out of them. It wasn't somebody misusing them. So that was the key. This really helped unlock. I immediately sent that to Colton and Dr. Zaromsky and to Gene Fritchie and to the Workmans, all of these people who've owned these now or in the past. And they're astounded because they'd never been identified as jardiniers. They'd always been identified as bathtubs. I then also in that same book find this image of these newly named jardiniers. This is at the Court of Honor in the German representation on the exhibit in the Palace of Varied Industries. This is an even better picture. I found this one at the Missouri Historical Society. There's the jardiniere. There's Gustav Lind's lion's head. This is a 2,500-pound eagle that's now in Philadelphia at a Macy's store. It was purchased from the World's Fair by a businessman in Philadelphia, and he took it and put it in his shop, and it's still there 120 years later. And then, of course, these are the jardiniers as they look in our museum. So one mystery is solved. Yes, Gustav Lind had these items at the World's Fair in 1904. The second mystery that was solved that we didn't know was a mystery, these are not bathtubs. These are planters, jardiniers. There's the exhibit right now of this. I have a dream, actually, of somehow getting this item and the two jardiniers together, putting them on either side, a special exhibit, maybe at the new World's Fair exhibit up at the Missouri History Museum. That's the Palace of Varied Industries when it was under construction in November of 1903. There are the two towers. That's the east side entrance into this structure. These are the two towers again. This is the main entrance into this structure as you come in the main gate at the World's Fair. This photo was taken on opening day. So what I'm about to explain is, if anybody at the fair, and 20 million people were there, if anyone at the fair walked underneath these two towers into this entryway and then into the vestibule, they would have immediately found themselves among all of these items on the German exhibit agenda. And they would have seen from the vestibule coming into the building, that's what they would have seen in the distance. They would have seen the eagle. This whole area was designed here by Bruno Moring. You can see how big it was just by comparing. We're talking about this German eagle right here, and here it is as these men were installing it on the grounds of the World's Fair. So this was a huge space. It looks sort of small in the photo, but this was actually a huge exhibit space. Now the photographer has walked behind the eagle. This is the entrance area that you just came in off the fairgrounds. You can see a little bit of the Jardinieres here, a little bit of the side panels, and here as well. So a person could have actually gone in this direction and seen them very clearly. And of course, if they go down the steps and then they approach and look at the eagle from the front, they see them on both sides. There's the eagle. From the other side, there's the Jardiniere. There's Gustav Lind's lion's head, and there's the eagle. And so for the first time ever, we had a photograph of these items on the grounds of the World's Fair. No one had ever been able to find one before, in part because people were searching for bathtubs instead of for planters or Jardinieres. So how did they get to Knob Lick? That's a question. Well, to begin with, I did not know this, but there were actually firms, this one here, created in 1892 to clean up the grounds of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So they would go in, they would recycle everything they could, they would get rid of what they could not. Point I'm making is everything was for sale practically at the end of a fair. Remember, it was temporary, 7 months in the case of the St. Louis Fair. At the end of the 7 months, these 62 nations did not want to pack up, crate up, box up all of their items, ship them back across the ocean. So they offered them for sale. In this case, a salvage company bid on the entire grounds of the St. Louis World's Fair. You can see even the toilets that were used on the fair were cleaned up and resold. Remember, 20 million people visited. There were probably 1,000 toilets spread out on the grounds of that fair. And this company decides, among other things, they're going to sell these toilets. They even named them here the WF for World's Fair, so people would know, hey, I've got a World's Fair toilet. I'm sure there are still some of these toilets in St. Louis, in some of those older homes. And in this same book also that we looked at a minute ago, I found that the Germans had decided they were going to sell everything. They were going to put everything that was German in the hands of a German American named Ferdinand Wiederhold, and anybody could come up and see this man at that palace any day of the exhibit and begin the process of acquiring those goods. So I'm imagining somebody comes up, they see the Jardinieres, they offer a price, perhaps there's some haggling, and then they're in that person's name until the fair is actually over. Obviously, somebody bought them from the fair. And that Mr. Wiederhold actually was so successful at doing a good job of selling off the German section at the World's Fair that when he became partner in another furniture company in St. Louis in 1905, they put an advertisement in the Globe Democrat and also in the German language newspaper of St. Louis called America, so that people had become familiar with this German American, in part because of the work he did liquidating the German exhibit at the World's Fair. In terms of Knob Lick, a lot of people from Knob Lick were jumping on the Iron Mountain Railroad and heading north, going to the fair. So it's clear then that people in this area, I found this for Farmington and Bonne Terre, Fredericktown, Noblick, people in this area are very keen to get to the World's Fair. A lot of them are heading up. We've got the railroad that goes right up from Noblick into St. Louis. So maybe somebody in Noblick saw these items, wanted them. It would have been easy to transport them back to the area at the end of the fair via the railroad, but we don't know. I do know this. This is the piece of property on which they were found in 1973. Mr. Casey of the famous Casey family of Farmington owned that piece of property in 1882. Mr. Turpin owned that same piece of property in 1901. Mr. McLaren owned it in 1930. And a woman named Kay King owned that same piece of property in 1972. Now, I know that James McLaren, who was an immigrant from Scotland, born there in 1860, I know that he actually was living on this property by 1910 because I found him in the U.S. Census. I also know that Mr. McLaren's wife's sister and his wife had lived in Noblick for many decades, and I know that his wife's sister's children went to the World's Fair because I found an account of one of the daughters who had been there. So it's possible that this family, the McLarens, with Mrs. McLaren's sister, had gone to the World's Fair. They decided to get these items. They brought them back to this piece of land. Mr. McLaren died in 1925, Mrs. McLaren in 1936, and perhaps those items lingered there. But I don't think that they would have been left there at that time. So I'm really more pointing to the King family. The man she was married to had a father who was a police officer in St. Louis, and he also had purchased one share of stock in the Louisiana Purchase Corporation. So obviously they were familiar with the World's Fair. Some of them also worked at fancy hotels in St. Louis. And these Jardinieres are very much something that you might find outside a hotel or in the entryway of a hotel. And I know that the Kings are living there on the property by 1940 because I found them on the U.S. Census. He dies in the 50s, she dies in the 70s, and then in 1973, the Jennings family purchased the piece of land. So maybe that's how they got there. Don't know. There were just a few more things I wanted to discover about Mr. Lind. One, I wanted to know where he was buried. We had St. Matthias in Sudindi, so I got this 1907 Berlin map. I started, blowing it up. Finally found an area called Sudindi, found a cemetery called St. Matthias. This is what it looks like today. These images are from Find a Grave and Google Maps. And then I got in touch with this cemetery and asked them about Gustav Lind. And I thought maybe there might be a really nice structure there that his metal sculptor friends had put together for him. But come to find out, I did not know this, Germany is a period of repose cemetery. Most of the cemeteries in Germany, you lease it for 20 years. And then if no family member ups your lease, they dig you up. Whatever's left, you're disposed of, the grave marker is recycled, and then somebody else occupies the piece of ground that you were buried in. So highly likely where Mr. Lind was buried in 1903, there have been 6 other people recycled through that same plot in the cemetery. Point being, there's nothing left of Mr. Lind in this cemetery. They did send me their records, though, to prove that he had been there, that he was buried there. And this actually gave me another bit of information about his death, because his death certificate didn't say how he died. He died of chronic inflamed kidneys. And if you are exposed to a lot of copper, that can cause chronic inflamed kidneys. So I'm guessing he was poisoning himself over 2 decades of working with copper and other types of metals. And he would have been buried about right here, they said, in what today is number 10. But there's nothing left. He's gone. I also discovered that even after his death, there continued to be items published in Germany that would point out some of the pieces he had created. I mean, look at those, they're beautiful. And these here I think are very reminiscent of the figures on the Jardinieres here. And then this was the big discovery because I wanted to see him. I truly spent 3 months with this guy, thinking about him, researching him, studying him, trying to understand this World's Fair and how these items got to St. Louis and then made their way to Nablus. And then I went through several librarians in Potsdam, Nuremberg, Berlin, another one in Berlin, and finally a librarian in Berlin said, I think there's this book out there, but we don't have it. And she gave me the email contact for another library in Berlin. I sent them an email, and they were able to take a few snapshots with their cell phone of what was inside this book, including a photograph of Mr. Lind, including a photograph of these items that were on display at the World's Fair. So I hired a Berlin photographer to go into this library, which coincidentally was a 5-minute walk from the home that Mr. Lind died in 1903. I hired a photographer. He went in because I wanted to get some really good digitized images. This is not one of the digitized. This is one that was sent to me via cell phone, but it gives you an idea of more of Mr. Lind's work. And that one actually still exists. There it is. It's now the Museum of Communication. It used to be a post office in Germany. This is the one, though, that really I found extremely important to get a good digitized image of. That's the Jardiniere now that is across the way. That's what it looked like at the World's Fair. This is the lion's head. That's what it looked like at the World's Fair. So we now know for sure Gustav Lind created these planters. We know for sure they were on the grounds of the World's Fair. Obviously, we know for sure they made it to that piece of property where Denzel and Joanne Jennings discovered them in 1973. We know for sure they're not bathtubs, they're planters. We still don't know, though, who brought them to that property. I'm still working on that one mystery, but let me show you a picture of Gustav. There he is. This publication was 1905, 2 years after he died, so it's sort of a memorial to him, and it contains all of the items he had created that were all over Germany at the time. He was a teacher of the art of metalworking, and then in 1891 he founded this company and ran it for almost 12 years until he died, and then it was sold to Paul Kruger. I wanted to get together everyone still living who had been associated with these items, and I was able to do it. This is Jean Fritchie and Annette Fritchie. They own both of these Jardinieres now. This is one of the metalsmiths, and the other metalsmith, Stan Winkler and Lloyd Irvin. They're the two who restored these items in 1981. Of course, there's Colton and me and Dr. Zaromsky. This is Melissa and Bruce Workman, and they owned, at one point, they owned this item. And this is a World's Fair collector who came with the two restorer gentlemen. So we got together here on campus and we talked about these, and I gave them a preliminary of the research I had found. And I do want to mention to you that right now there's a World's Fair exhibit at the Missouri History Museum. It is magnificent. I took my mother up there to see Judy Garland's dress from the 1944 movie Meet Me in St. Louis. You'll also, at that exhibit, they've got the entire fair there in model form, so you can see how it was laid out. This is the Palace of Varied Industries. There's the two towers. Mr. Lind's items were probably right beneath that area. And every once in a while, they then impose a current map. So, superimpose a current map on top of the model so you can see what's there now in those same places from 1904. So if you've not been to the World's Fair exhibit at the Missouri History Museum, please go. And of course now we can get rid of the idea that they're bathtubs. One more thing, and here's an opportunity for you to win some wonderful candy. Does anyone know what fairy floss is? And I know Colton knows because he was there already. So Colton, you are, what? That's right, cotton candy. The hamburger was not created at the St. Louis World's Fair. The hot dog was not. Iced tea was not. The ice cream cone was not. They were popularized there because all eyes were on this World's Fair. Cotton candy was not invented there either, but cotton candy was invented shortly before in Nashville. Believe it or not, one of the two inventors of the cotton candy machine was a dentist. And indeed, cotton candy became known all over the country because of the World's Fair. And here you can see, these are advertisements in St. Louis newspapers the month the World's Fair closes, because people had gotten a taste for cotton candy on those 1,200 acre fairgrounds, and now they might want some. It is still called fairy floss in Australia. Some call it candy floss. Some call it daddy's beard. If you translate literally from their language, it's called dragon's beard in China, old lady's hair, and girl's hair. So that, friends, is the mystery of Gustav Lind, nearly solved. And should I find out exactly how those items got to that piece of property outside of Noblik, I'll let you know. Thank you so much for coming, and stick around for a second. I've got a bunch of cotton candy to give you. Truly. Thank you, everybody.